In this video, we'll set up PI Data Archive and PIPOINT access for a new PI interface and for PI Buffer Subsystem, which we're using to buffer the data. We'll want to configure the minimum needed permissions for this, as described in this KB article, 7 Best Practices for Securing Your PI Server. Now, before we start, let's go over the plan. We'll create identities, and keep in mind that to create identities, we have to be using PI Data Archive version 3.4.380 36 and later. So we'll create identities, and we're going to create separate identities for PI interfaces and PI buffers. And the reason why separate identities are needed is because interfaces and buffering don't need access to the same things. Once our identities are created, we're going to need to have ways for interfaces and buffering to authenticate and receive these identities. So for the PI interface, we're going to be creating a trust, and almost all PI interfaces connect to the PI Data Archive using the PI API protocol. And because of this, we have to use trusts. We cannot use mappings. However, if we are using PI Buffer Subsystem version 3.4.380 79 and later, we are going to be able to use a mapping for PI Buffer Subsystem. And in this system, I'm going to be able to do that because I'm running all the latest versions. Let's get started by opening up PI System Management Tools. So I'm going to navigate to a machine where I have PI System Management Tools installed. And to be able to successfully perform the steps in this video, I'm going to have permissions to configure security. And if I select one of these plugins, you can see down at the bottom that I am authenticating and receiving PI admins. And that's because I'm the PI administrator of this system. And I've confirmed that PI admins has the permissions needed. We'll start off in Identities, Users, and Groups and create the identities for PI interfaces and PI buffers. So I'll right-click and do New Identity, and let's do PI interfaces, and I'll go ahead and give it a description and hit Create. And I'll do the same thing for PI buffers. And hit Create as well. Okay, great. So I have my two PI interfaces and PI buffers identities created. And now I'm going to go ahead and switch over to Mappings and Trusts. And I'm going to start off on the Trust tab. And I want to create the trust for my PI interface. Now, to see all the required fields for a trust right away, I like to go to Advanced here, and this pulls up all the information that I'll need to fill out. Now, I want to point out a couple pieces of information that we'll need to go get from our PI interface node. So we can see here that we'll need to know the computer name or IP address, and we'll also have this field for application name, and this is going to be the API connection name. So let's jump over to the machine where we have our PI interface instance installed, and let's collect these pieces of information. Okay, so now I'm on the machine where my PI interface is installed. I can open up PI Interface Configuration Utility, and you can see that this PI interface for OPC-DA instance is the one that I'm setting up the trust for. Now, what I want to do is first get the IP address of this machine. To do this, I'm going to use the command prompt, so I'll type in CMD, and then I'll right-click so I can run as administrator. And here I'm going to get the IP address by typing ipconfig, and this is the IP address, so I'm going to go ahead and write this down. I also want to make sure I know the name of this machine, And an easy way to verify that is under Computer Properties. Okay, so I can see the computer name, the FQDN here. So I'll make a note of those. And finally, I'm going to jump back to the PI ICU because there's something that I need to check for this interface instance under the Union tab. What I need to look for is the API connection name here. So if there is an API connection name specified here, I'll need to write that down. In my case, there isn't a name specified here, so I know that my PI interface instance is going to be using the default API connection name. Okay, so we're ready to return to where we have PI System Management Tools open and configure our trust. The first step is to give the trust a name, and we just want to make sure that the name helps distinguish what this trust is used for. So you'll see that I like to say what it's for, so that's our PIOPC interface, and that it's coming from the machine PIPOINT, and I'm going to be setting up this trust by IP address, so I've added IP to the name. And I'll go ahead and give this a description as well. Okay, so now here, I'm not going to specify the network path because I'm doing this trust by the IP address, and I'm going to be filling in the IP address here. You should only fill in the network path or the IP address. Don't fill them out both for the same trust. So let's do the IP address that we just wrote down. And then right below IP address, you can see that we have net mask. You use the net mask to specify the subnet of IP addresses which the trust applies to. And the best practice is to have the trust only apply to a specific IP address. And to do that, I'll need to fill in 255 across for the net mask. Next, I'm going to go down here to specify the application information name. And this is the API connection name that we just checked to see if it was in the PI ICU under the Union tab. In my case, it wasn't, so it's using the default API connection name for the interface, and I happen to know what that is, so I'm going to go ahead and fill that out. If you don't know what the API connection name is, I will show you how you can get that information. And you'll notice that I have specified both the IP address and the application name. And if you specify either the network path or IP address and the application information name, you're creating what's called a 2+ trust. And it's our best practice to always create 2+ trusts. So making sure to always specify the application information name. Then as a final step, I need to select the PI identity that this trust will be for. So I'll search and pick my PI interface's identity that I just created and hit OK. Okay, so let's say you didn't know what the application name is for your PI interface. I'm going to show you how you can get this information from a connection in the message logs. So you can go to Operation Message Logs, and anytime that there's a connection to the PI data archive, even if it fails because the application doesn't have the right permissions, it will still get logged in our messages. And about 15 minutes ago, I know that I started the interface before I configured security, but I know that I'll see a message from then. to help me filter my message logs, I'm going to go ahead and put the IP address of the interface node in the message filter. Okay, so I can go ahead and see the connection. Here I see a new connection ID, and yep, just like I thought, we have the default OPC PE API connection name. And if I look at some of the other messages, I can see that, yep, I didn't have a trust for this, but regardless, these messages are providing me with the API application name that I'll need to use for the trust. Okay, so let me return to the mappings and trusts and the trust tab. So creating your trust by the IP address will work as long as you have static IP addresses. Now, if you're in a situation where you might not have static IP addresses, then you'll need to create trusts also by the machine name. So let's go ahead and do that in case you're in that situation. A really easy way to copy the trust is I can right-click and hit copy. And I'll just change this trust so it's for the FQDN instead. And I'll need to clear the IP address since I'm specifying the network path. And then I'll hit OK. So now I have by FQDN, and I'll copy this one to do one for the short name too. And hit OK. Alright, so I successfully created the trust for my PI interface, but I'm also planning on buffering my data with PI Buffer Subsystem. And we planned out that we're going to create a mapping for PI Buffer Subsystem. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Mapping tab. And what I'll need to do is I'll need to get the account that the PI Buffer Subsystem is running under. So let's jump back to my PI interface machine so I can confirm that. So again, this machine, I'm going to check services. And down here, I need to figure out what service account I'm running PI Buffer Subsystem under. Okay, so I can see that it's PI School, SVC PI Buffers. Okay, got that. So I'm going to switch back to PI System Management Tools. And I'll right-click and create my new mapping. And I'll go ahead and check the name. Yep, okay. And I'll go ahead and give this mapping a description. And then I'm going to assign the PI Buffers identity. And then hit create. Okay, so I've created my identities. I've created a mapping for PI Buffer Subsystem. I've created 3 2+ trusts for my PI interface instance, but they still won't be able to connect because I haven't set up the permissions yet for my PI buffers and PI interfaces identities. So what permissions do they need? A good way to figure out the minimum needed permissions is let's check out that KB article on the 7 best practices for securing our PI server. And if I scroll down, we can see that Tip 5 is about how to configure minimum permissions for interfaces. And there's a couple handy tables that will tell us what permissions that we need. So you would want to pick the table that matches your case. To start off with, let's say that we weren't doing buffering, then if we didn't have output points, we'd just be setting up the permissions for the interface here. And we can see that we need PIPOINT on the database security table for read, and we'll also need read on point security and write on data security. However, I know that I do want to go ahead and do buffering, so let me go up there and see, okay, for buffering and no output points, these are the permissions that I'm going to set. I know that both my PI interfaces and PI Buffer's identity are going to need read on the database security table, and then the specific point security and data security is going to be different depending on if it's the interface's identity or the buffering identity. So let's go ahead and first do database security. So I'm going to go security, database security here. And PIPOINT, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to add my PI interfaces and PI buffers as read. Okay, so I've added PI interfaces and PI buffers as read here. Perfect. Now, the rest of the settings are going to be based on the individual PI points that the interface is sending the data to. So I'm going to switch to points and point builder, and I'm going to search for a particular PI point from this interface. These are all the PI points for this interface, and I'm going to configure security on the first one, pump 1 bearing temp. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to the security tab, and let's consult that KB article again. Okay, so first we'll configure point security. So point security, read for PI interfaces, and read for PI buffers. Okay, and then data security. Looks like the interface doesn't need data security at all, and because we're using buffering to actually write the data, it's going to need read and write on data security. Okay, so read and write on data security there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit save and confirm that I successfully edited my PIPOINT. I'm going to return to my PI interface machine and start my PI interface to confirm that my security was working successfully. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I want to make sure to view the PI message logs when I start my interface. I'll double click this and then I'll go ahead and start. Okay, and I can see that my PI interface was able to successfully start up. And if I look, I can also see that it successfully found the PI point. Keep in mind that we are using PI Buffer Subsystem to write the data to this PIPOINT, and I can also look at the buffering statistics. If I go to Tools Buffering, and I focus on my particular PI data archive, I can see that the total number of events, which in this case is the one PIPOINT that I'm writing to, is continuing to increase. And let's also make sure that we are receiving data for that PIPOINT. So if I do a search for pump 1 bearing temp here, and I hover over pump 1 bearing temp, I can indeed see that we have a value that we just wrote. However, keep in mind that we just changed and set up the security on one PIPOINT. We're going to need to make those same security changes on all of the PIPOINTs that this interface is used to send data to. A quick way to do this is to actually use the PI Builder Excel plugin versus using Point Builder and PySMT. So I'm going to actually do that in Excel, and I have prepared a sheet where basically I have all the PIPOINTs for my interface, and I'm going to be changing their data security and point security in the same way we just did for one of them. And so you can see that I have already added the buffers and the PI interface's identity permissions to the strings here. So the only thing I need to do is go ahead and hit publish. And I've successfully edited the security on all the PIPOINTs for this interface. Keep in mind that if you're interested in using PI Builder, we do actually have a playlist on our YouTube channel about PI Builder. So I'm going to jump back to PI System Management Tools. And it may take some time for the interface to pick up these changes. If I need the changes to be picked up right away, I can restart the PI interface. But in my case, I just edited a relatively small number of PIPOINTs, so I'm just going to see if I have updating data for them yet. So I'm going to, search for all of the points for this interface and hit OK. Okay, and perfect. I can see that I am receiving current values for them and the values are updating. Alright, so I have successfully configured the minimum needed permissions for my PI interface and PI Buffer Subsystem to write data to these PIPOINTs. Keep in mind that if you are interested in setting up additional PI interfaces, the process is the same, and even if other interfaces are installed on the same machine, we would still go about the process of creating separate trusts for them, and we just specify the appropriate API application name for the different interfaces.